The autumn wind swept through Central Park with a crisp, whispering insistence, tossing crimson and gold leaves along the winding paths. William Reynolds strode with purpose, his polished leather shoes barely making a sound on the damp pavement. At 42, he had built Reynolds Enterprises into a global tech empire, his name synonymous with innovation, precision, and ruthless business acumen. Yet despite the world at his fingertips, his heart had grown hollow. His existence was a carefully ordered ledger of meetings, contracts, and acquisitions, leaving no room for the messy unpredictability of human connection. He kept his gaze forward, lost in thoughts of quarterly projections and the looming board meeting that would consume the next 6 hours, when a small, tremulous voice cut through the crisp air. "Please, sir, would you like to buy our necklace?" William slowed almost imperceptibly. Ahead, 2 identical girls stood on the cobblestone path, their auburn hair catching the sunlight like strands of fire, their emerald eyes wide with a mixture of hope and anxiety. One held out a delicate silver necklace, its heart-shaped pendant glinting in the autumn light, while the other fidgeted nervously beside her. Their clothes were worn, patched in places but meticulously clean, and their small hands clutched the necklace as though it were a treasure beyond measure. For a moment, William almost walked past. He had no time for street vendors or charity appeals. His world moved in a precise rhythm, one that left no space for the intrusion of strangers, especially children. And yet something in the girl's voice, fragile, urgent, trembling with sincerity, made him pause. He looked down at the necklace and his breath caught. The filigree design, delicate and intricate, seemed impossibly familiar. He bent slightly, squinting at the tiny inscription on the back, and a wave of memory hit him with the force of a tidal wave. He had seen this exact pattern before, had once given such a necklace to Melissa on their first anniversary. The necklace he had believed had been buried with her 5 years ago, along with their twin daughters, in a tragedy that had left his life a carefully constructed shell. "How much?" His voice was softer than he expected, carrying a weight that surprised even him. The twins exchanged a glance, their wide eyes reflecting both hope and fear. "Whatever you can pay," the one holding the necklace answered, her voice quivering. "We just need it for our mom. She's really sick." William reached for his wallet almost instinctively, the bills inside a tangible tool he could offer against the intangibility of suffering. "Will this help?" he asked, extending the money. The girl's eyes widened, disbelief and relief mingling on their faces. Abigail carefully placed the necklace in his hand, her fingers lingering for a moment, a fleeting connection between desperation and trust before letting go. "Thank you, sir," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "This will help our mom a lot." William nodded, pocketing the necklace. He should have turned away, returned to his appointments, and let the moment dissolve into the blur of his meticulously scheduled life. But he didn't. He found himself watching as the twins hurried along the path, their heads bent together, speaking in hurried whispers, their pace quick, urgent, determined. Something inside him stirred, something he hadn't felt in years. A pull that defied reason, a need to know more, to reach beyond the barriers he had so carefully constructed. For the first time in a long while, William Reynolds hesitated. And in that pause, the first tendrils of change threaded through the edges of his ordered, lonely world. The twins disappeared down a narrow side path, their small forms swallowed by the fluttering veil of falling leaves. William Reynolds hesitated, a strange, unfamiliar weight pressing against his chest. He could feel the pulse of the city around him, the laughter of distant children, the clatter of a cyclist's bell, the steady hum of cars beyond the park. But all of it seemed distant, muted, irrelevant. Only the image of the girls and that silver necklace remained sharply in focus. Something about the filigree's intricate design gnawed at the edges of his memory. He had seen it before, he was certain of it, but where? A sudden surge of unease settled over him, prickling at the base of his neck. He could not ignore it. Not this time. The city's rhythm, which he normally navigated with effortless precision, now felt foreign, even chaotic. Without fully understanding why, he gestured to his driver, who had been hovering quietly in the distance. "Follow them," William said, his voice low, more an instinct than a command. The word startled even him. It was as if the universe had pressed him into a role he had not auditioned for. "I need to see where they live." As the sleek black sedan wove through the city streets behind the twins, William's mind churned with fragments of memory he had long buried. He saw Melissa's smile, heard her laugh echoing in their old apartment, remembered the day he had clasped that very necklace around her neck, feeling a foolish hope that love could somehow be pinned into permanence, into silver and gold. And then the accident, an endless, jagged scar on time that had taken her, the girls he had known as daughters, and left him adrift. For years he had constructed walls around himself, layers of contracts, deals, and acquisitions to avoid feeling the hollowness. Yet here, in the midst of autumn and leaves and two trembling girls, that wall was cracking. The twins led the car into a forgotten neighborhood, a labyrinth of brick apartment blocks with rust-stained fire escapes and flickering neon signs advertising half-forgotten convenience stores. The contrast with William's polished, orderly world was jarring. The air here smelled faintly of mildew and unwashed clothes, mingled with the faint tang of distant trash fires. It was a world he had never entered willingly, and yet, as he observed Abigail and Emily from the tinted windows, a strange and unfamiliar thread of responsibility tightened inside him. They stopped in front of a building that seemed to sag under its own age, the paint peeling like dried skin. The girls hesitated before climbing the concrete stairs, and William noticed how they instinctively held each other close, a silent pact of mutual protection. Every movement, every glance spoke of resilience born from hardship, of courage that had nothing to do with wealth or power. And for the first time in years, William felt powerless, not in a boardroom, not in negotiations, not against competitors, but powerless to ignore the pull they had created in him. He stepped out of the car, the leather of his shoes cracking softly against the uneven sidewalk. His heart hammered as he climbed the 4 flights of stairs behind them. With every step, suspense twisted tighter in his chest. What would he find at the door? Who was their mother? Would he regret involving himself? Or had fate, in the cruelest and most exquisite twist, given him a chance to confront the emptiness he had been nursing for years? At the top, the twins reached a door with peeling blue paint, and one of them peered out suspiciously. "It's the man from the park," she whispered, and the door creaked open, revealing 2 pairs of wide, cautious eyes staring up at him. Behind them, a faint outline of a figure could be seen, lying still, too weak to rise. The air was thick with despair, and the first sight of the mother, a fragile, almost ghostly woman, stole his breath away. The necklace in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest, a silent reminder that this was no coincidence. Some invisible thread of fate had brought him here, to this forgotten corner of the city, to these girls, to their mother. And deep down, William knew that whatever happened next would change everything. Because in that small, dim apartment, he realized he was no longer a passive observer of the world. He was about to step into a story that would demand everything of him: his wealth, his control, and, most terrifyingly, his heart. William stood frozen for a moment on the threshold of the apartment, the lingering chill of the autumn air outside, contrasting with the faint, sour warmth inside. The twins had stepped back hesitantly, their hands barely touching the chipped doorframe, as if they weren't sure whether to trust him, or if trusting anyone could ever be safe. Behind them, the faint, ragged breathing of their mother filled the room, a fragile, uneven rhythm that made William's chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. The apartment was small, impossibly sparse, and yet meticulously cared for. A thin mattress lay in the corner, a threadbare blanket pulled up over a slight figure whose chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. There were no toys, no books, no traces of a childhood that wasn't overshadowed by worry, survival, and constant vigilance. Every detail whispered of a life teetering on the edge of despair, of nights spent silent and sleepless, watching, waiting. And somehow, despite the decay, the girl's resilience shone through, bright and stubborn like the tiny shafts of light filtering through the grimy windows. Can I help?" William's voice was low, almost hesitant, alien to him. It carried the weight of someone unused to asking permission to enter someone else's life. The twins exchanged glances, their emerald eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. Abigail's hand moved toward the necklace in his pocket, her fingers brushing the fabric of his coat as though confirming that this stranger, this man who had inexplicably followed them, was somehow connected to something larger than herself. The mother's breathing grew shallower, and William realized that the woman wasn't merely ill, she was deteriorating rapidly. Fever burned beneath her skin, her limbs were weak, and every shallow breath sounded like a whispered plea. The twins' small shoulders sagged, and Emily's voice quavered as she muttered, She gets worse every day. We don't know what to do. A cold, urgent clarity washed over William, cutting through the fog of his detached, ordered existence. This was no longer a moment to hesitate. No spreadsheet, no boardroom, no calculated risk could compare to the immediate, undeniable need in this room. Without thinking, he stepped closer, gently pressing his hands under the woman's frail arms to lift her slightly. Her eyes flickered open, dim and unfocused, and for an instant, the resemblance struck him so violently he stumbled inwardly. The curve of her jaw, the delicate line of her nose, the quiet, haunted grace like looking into the past he had thought forever lost. "We need a hospital. Now," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She can't stay here." Abigail shook her head, tears brimming. "We can't. We don't have money. That's why we were selling the necklace." The necklace. William's hand instinctively brushed his pocket, feeling the cool silver against his palm, a symbol, a thread, a bridge between loss and this moment. He felt a surge of something he hadn't named in years: responsibility, guilt, a fierce need to protect. "Money isn't the problem," he said firmly. "You sold me the necklace, right? Now let me do my part." There was a raw authority in his voice, one that wasn't born of contracts or power, but of something purer: instinct, empathy, the sudden awakening of a man who had thought himself untouchable to life's fragility. The twins hesitated, wide-eyed, before finally nodding. Abigail moved closer, her small hands brushing against his coat as if anchoring herself to the certainty in his words. Emily whispered a barely audible, "Thank you," that carried a weight far greater than any words could hold. William carried their mother down the narrow stairwell, every creaking step echoing in the hollow building, a cadence that seemed to mark the passage between despair and hope. Outside, the air hit them sharply, crisp and alive, a stark contrast to the suffocating quiet of the apartment. The car waited, engine humming, sleek and black and utterly foreign to the small family it now held within. As they drove through the city, William's mind raced. This wasn't a random act. The necklace, the girls, their mother. It was as if fate had placed them squarely in his path, demanding he confront the emotional void he had cultivated for so long. And yet fear gnawed at him too. What if he wasn't enough? What if this woman didn't survive? What if he had crossed a line he could never return from? The twins clutched each other's hands in the back seat, their eyes wide, scanning him, silently questioning. And in that shared unspoken glance, William realized the truth. None of them would leave this night unchanged. Their lives, his carefully ordered existence, the fragile threads of the past he thought he had buried, all of it had collided in one desperate, trembling moment, and the necklace, glinting faintly in his pocket, seemed to pulse with unspoken promise, as if whispering that the story had only just begun. The hospital doors slid open with a sterile hiss, the scent of antiseptic and muted anxiety greeting them like a warning. William carried Jennifer in his arms, her body frail and trembling, each breath shallow and ragged. The twins followed closely, their small hands brushing the hem of his coat as though the act could tether them to hope. The fluorescent lights above flickered briefly, and William felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the gravity of what lay ahead. A nurse glanced up, eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of a stranger bearing a sick woman. "Sir, are you—" "She needs immediate attention," William said, his voice calm but edged with authority that demanded compliance. "No time to explain. Please help her." In an instant, the sterile corridors transformed into a battlefield of urgency. William's carefully controlled world of boardrooms and profit margins gave way to an environment ruled by raw, relentless stakes: life and death. Nurses and doctors converged, questions fired rapidly, and monitors beeped with a harsh mechanical rhythm. William handed over Jennifer to a team of paramedics, but he could not let go. His presence, previously a stranger hovering at the edge of life, was now an anchor. The twins hovered, their eyes wide, hearts clutched in tiny fists of worry. Abigail's fingers found Emily's, squeezing tight, grounding themselves in each other. Emily's whisper barely reached William's ears. Will she make it?" He knelt beside the stretcher, resting a hand on Jennifer's frail arm, feeling the heat of her fever through his own palm. "She's strong," he said, the words more prayer than statement. "And we're going to make sure she's safe. I promise." The doctor arrived, a tall man with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Severe dehydration, probable kidney failure, he muttered, checking vitals and scanning the charts. How long has she been in this condition? Weeks, William said, his tone steady, though inside his mind spun. They've been caring for her as best they could. He glanced at the twins, whose shoulders slumped with fear and fatigue, the weight of responsibility far too heavy for their small frames. The doctor's eyes softened slightly. Immediate dialysis, IV fluids, constant monitoring. She's critical. Time collapsed into urgency. William signed forms, authorized treatments, and provided insurance information as though he had been prepared for this moment all his life. Each decision, each signature was a thread weaving him irreversibly into the lives of these strangers. Strangers who, in some inexplicable way, already felt like family. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. The twins remained beside him, dozing fitfully in chairs that offered little comfort, their hands occasionally brushing his arm, seeking reassurance. William observed them in quiet awe. Two girls forced into courage and self-reliance far beyond their years, yet holding on to love so fierce it could not be extinguished. Their mother's life now rested in a precarious balance, and in protecting her, William discovered a pulse of humanity he had long thought buried. When the doctor finally emerged, exhaustion etched into his features. The twins stirred, wide-eyed, clinging to William's coat. "Is she going to die?" Abigail asked, her small voice trembling with raw terror. The doctor hesitated, then nodded slightly. "She's stabilizing, but it's critical. Continued treatment is essential." A wave of relief washed through the twins, but William felt a deeper, more complex emotion, a surge of responsibility, of connection, of a life suddenly threaded with meaning beyond numbers and contracts. He realized then that the encounter in Central Park, the necklace, the girls, their mother, was not a random collision of events. It was a reckoning. Fate had forced him into a world he had long avoided, demanding that he confront the void within himself. As the night stretched into early dawn, William sat between the twins in the quiet hospital corridor, the faint hum of machines echoing through the empty halls. He could feel the weight of their trust, fragile and enormous, settling on his shoulders. Every instinct, every carefully measured decision he had ever made was irrelevant here. He was no longer a CEO observing from a distance. He was a guardian, an anchor, a witness to life teetering on the edge. And in that quiet, tension-laden space, he realized something terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Once you step into a story like this, once you touch a life so profoundly intertwined with yours, there is no turning back. The necklace in his pocket, a silent silver heartbeat, seemed to whisper a promise. This was only the beginning. The first light of morning filtered weakly through the hospital blinds, painting the corridor in a pale, almost fragile glow. William sat between the twins, his fingers resting lightly on theirs, though neither of them slept. Abigail's green eyes darted nervously to the closed door behind which their mother fought for life, and Emily's small hand occasionally brushed William's arm, seeking reassurance he didn't know how to give, yet could not refuse. The hospital, so sterile and impersonal, had become a crucible of emotion, and he was trapped within it, unprepared for the intensity of what it demanded. He thought of the necklace again, its delicate filigree etched into his memory, a connection between past and present, loss and possibility. It had brought him here, and now it seemed to pulse with a quiet insistence. Do not walk away. This was not charity. It was reckoning. And yet every moment he spent in this corridor, watching the twins clinging to hope, he felt the sharp pang of fear. What if he wasn't enough? What if he couldn't save her? When the doctor finally emerged from the room, exhaustion in his movements, William leaned forward. "How is she?" he asked, trying to keep the tremor from his voice. The doctor's expression was unreadable, professional, but the shadow beneath his eyes betrayed the urgency of the situation. "She's stable for now," he said cautiously, "but the damage is significant. We'll need continued dialysis and monitoring. Her recovery is not guaranteed." The twins exhaled, a collective release of tension, but William felt none of the relief. The words rang in his ears, "not guaranteed." The stakes were higher than he had imagined, and the fragility of life pressed down on him like a weight he had long avoided feeling. Abigail's small voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "What happens if she doesn't get better?" William caught Emily's hand as she squeezed his arm. her eyes wide with unspoken fear. He realized then that it was not just the mother's life hanging in the balance. It was their world, their security, their very sense of home. "I won't let that happen," he said, his voice low but firm, the first real note of conviction he had allowed himself in years. "She's getting the best care, and I'll make sure nothing stands in the way of her recovery." The twins looked at him, relief and skepticism tangled in their expressions. How could a stranger, a man so impossibly removed from their reality, possibly make such a promise? As the hours dragged on, William made arrangements, his mind racing through logistics he had never imagined needing to handle, coordinating with doctors, arranging continuous care, ensuring the girls had a place to rest, and simultaneously feeling the gnawing realization that his own life, the one meticulously ordered, measured and insulated, had already begun to unravel. Every phone call, every decision tethered him more tightly to these strangers, and yet he could not walk away. Finally, as Jennifer stabilized enough for the twins to briefly step outside, William made a decision that startled even him. "You don't have to go back to that apartment tonight," he said. "Not while your mother is here and not while she's still weak." The twins stared at him, disbelief warring with hope. "I'll take care of you," he added, the words heavy with unspoken meaning. "Just until she's better." Their wide eyes, gleaming with both wonder and caution, followed him through the corridors. William noticed almost painfully how small they were, how fragile yet how fiercely resilient. Each step they took together felt like a crossing of thresholds, not just the physical one from hospital to car, but one into a life neither they nor he had ever anticipated. The ride to his mansion was surreal. The city shifted from grimy streets and flickering neon signs to manicured lawns and grand silent homes. The twins pressed close, whispering to each other, their voices filled with awe and trepidation. They had never seen anything like this, and the enormity of it, the wealth, the space, the impossible luxury, was almost frightening. But in the back of their minds, the question lingered, would he really keep his promise? Would the kindness so sudden and overwhelming last? William's hands tightened around the steering wheel, not from anxiety about traffic or route, but from the gravity of the responsibility he had chosen to assume. This was no longer a simple act of charity. He was now a part of their lives, entwined in a way that could not be undone. Every decision, every word, every gesture would carry weight beyond his previous understanding. As the mansion loomed ahead, its vast windows reflecting the early morning sun, William realized that for the first time in years, his life felt less like a series of calculated moves and more like a story unfolding in real time. And in that unfolding, he understood something terrifying and exhilarating. The twins' world, fragile and desperate, had become inseparably entwined with his own, and there was no turning back. The mansion loomed before them like a cathedral of wealth, its grand facade bathed in the pale morning light. The twins stepped cautiously from the car, their small hands clutching each other's as if bracing for a dream too vast to be real. Abigail's eyes widened at the manicured gardens, the ornate gates, the perfectly aligned walkways that seemed to stretch endlessly. Emily's gaze flickered upward at the massive windows, trying to comprehend a space so immense it almost swallowed her. Every detail, the gleam of polished stone, the soft rustle of fountains, the subtle scent of expensive wood and leather, felt surreal, alien yet intoxicating. "Do you live here alone?" Emily whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sound of their footsteps on the marble driveway. William's reply was quiet, almost reluctant. "Not tonight," he said, surprising himself with the intimacy of the words. "Tonight you're here too." The twins looked at him, uncertainty and hope wrestling in their expressions. The words carried a weight that neither of them fully understood, but the promise embedded in them shimmered with the possibility of safety, of belonging. Inside, the mansion was a labyrinth of luxury, every room more overwhelming than the last. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, their facets catching the morning light and scattering it across the polished floors. Paintings, expensive and old, lined the walls, each one a silent sentinel observing the tiny intruders who wandered through, mouths slightly open in awe. The twins moved cautiously, touching marble banisters, running fingers along soft rugs, exploring rooms that were impossibly vast compared to the single apartment they had called home. "Do you think he has a pool?" Emily whispered almost to herself, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and delight. Probably 3, Abigail replied, as if stating a fact that made sense in this new, incomprehensible world. They giggled softly, the sound a fragile, bright thread weaving through the mansion's immense quiet. William followed from the study doorway, observing them, coffee in hand, a strange warmth blooming in his chest. The laughter of the twins, hesitant but real, pried open something long sealed within him, a place where grief, loss, and isolation had once held dominion. But as he watched, a shadow of doubt flickered across his thoughts. This intrusion into his life, sudden and unbidden, was more than a simple act of kindness. He could see it in the girls' wary glances, in the careful way they measured every new space, every luxurious object. They were resilient, yes, but they had been forged by hardship, and the fragility of their trust made the stakes razor-sharp. One misstep, one wrong word could fracture the delicate bond forming in this improbable sanctuary. Even as he arranged for their comfort, beds prepared, meals set, small necessities purchased, an unease simmered beneath his usual veneer of control. The necklace, tucked safely in his coat, seemed to pulse with a quiet insistence, a reminder that this encounter was not random. Every instinct in William's being whispered that the threads connecting them were deeper, older and more consequential than he could yet comprehend. The twins, emboldened by the safety and space, began to explore more freely. Emily perched on the edge of a grand piano, tentatively pressing the keys, producing hesitant, trembling notes that filled the cavernous room. Abigail wandered to a vast library, fingers brushing the spines of books that smelled of age and knowledge, as though the silent witnesses of centuries were watching her with quiet curiosity. William observed, a mix of pride and protective caution tightening in his chest. Their wonder was intoxicating, yes, but it was also fragile. This was a world they had never known, a world that could as easily overwhelm them as shelter them, and beneath that fragile awe he could sense something unspoken, a thread of fate, a mystery lurking beneath the surface, waiting to reveal itself. As the day stretched on, the hospital called with news that Jennifer was stabilizing, a momentary relief that brought light to the twins' exhausted faces. But William felt no reprieve. The tension, the suspense, the sense of inevitable revelation lingered. Something was coming, he could feel it, the quiet, inexorable truth that would bind their lives together forever, a truth shimmering just out of reach, waiting for the moment when everything would shatter and realign. And as he watched Abigail and Emily explore his home with cautious wonder, William Reynolds understood with a sudden, almost terrifying clarity, this was no temporary act of charity. Their worlds were now irrevocably intertwined. The mansion, the hospital, the necklace, the fragile lives of these children, they were all threads in a tapestry he had yet to fully comprehend. A tapestry that would soon demand more of him than he had ever been prepared to give, and yet, he was powerless to resist. The first tendrils of dawn crept through the tall windows of William's mansion, brushing the marble floors with pale light that seemed almost hesitant, as if wary of intruding upon the fragile stillness that hung in the air. The twins moved quietly through the corridors, their wide eyes tracing every detail, every curve of the vast home. But their thoughts were elsewhere, back at the hospital, with their mother. Jennifer's frail form, now stabilized but still tethered precariously to life, occupied every anxious heartbeat they possessed. William followed them at a measured distance, his mind a storm of reflection, fear, and anticipation. Over the past few days, he had been pulled from his meticulously ordered world into a maelstrom of urgent decisions, emotional awakenings, and unexpected responsibility. Every instinct, every carefully honed skill he had ever relied upon as a CEO, now seemed insufficient in the face of human vulnerability and raw need. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt awake, fully alive, connected to something beyond contracts and boardrooms, connected to life itself. As the twins gathered near the grand staircase, Abigail suddenly paused, her gaze fixed on a photograph tucked into the ornate frame of a hallway table. William approached and followed her line of sight. The image was old, faded around the edges, a woman with auburn hair and striking green eyes smiling broadly, holding a small child in each arm. The resemblance was impossible to ignore, the curve of the jaw, the tilt of the eyes, the gentle strength in their posture.